From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melithopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Florida seems very different from Oregon, but as you're going to hear in this episode, there's a lot of similarities when it comes to pollination. This week, we're talking to Dr. Rachel Mallinger. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Entomology and Nematology at the University of Florida. She has an extension appointment very much like mine here in Oregon, as well as a very vibrant research program. And as you'll hear in Florida, there's a lot of similar concerns. There's a lot of interest in blueberry pollination. There's a lot of interest in pollinators in forests, and also the intense interest from the master gardeners in terms of pollination is something that's shared in Florida. So let's take a trip right across the continent and let's talk with Dr. Rachel Mallinger about pollinator issues and extension in Florida. Okay, well, Dr. Mallinger, welcome to Pollination.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Florida is a pretty exotic place, especially to us Oregonians. It's probably as far away from Oregon as you can get in the continental U.S. Can you tell us a little bit about the bees of Florida and some of the challenges they face, and what are some of the specific needs for pollinator health in Florida?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I moved here from North Dakota, and about as different as you can get. And, certainly it's different from Oregon too. So in terms of the bees in particular, Florida is pretty unique. So we don't have the cold that much of the rest of the country gets. And a lot of bee species require that cold. So Florida actually has a lower bee diversity than much of the rest of the country. So there are about an estimated 315 species of native bees in Florida. Compare that to 500, 600, closer to 1,000 in the Southwest. It's a lower bee diversity. And in particular, certain groups like bumblebees, we don't have as many species of bumblebees and they're not as common. But we also have certain bees that you don't find elsewhere. So there are a lot of perdita bees. These are bees that are ground nesters. Oh. They're very small. They like sandy soils, which of course we have a lot of here in Florida. So the bee community is a little bit different. In terms of some of the challenges that they face, I think there are some aspects of land management as well as land use change that are unique to Florida. So, of course, Florida is one of the most populated states in the country and is undergoing rapid development. It also has still a fair amount of cropland. So just in terms of habitat loss and development, I think that more so than many other places is just a really big pressure on bees and on other wildlife too. Mm-hmm. And other sort of land management aspects that may be unique to Florida. Much of Florida is actually wooded, forested, especially in the northern half or so. And those ecosystems are naturally regulated by fire. And of course, with fire suppression, we now as humans prescribe fire. We implement those burns. And those fires can happen at any time of the year. And so one of the things I'm interested in looking at is how these fire regimes and the timing of fire affects bees. That's, of course, something that happens elsewhere. You have fire that happens in the prairies in the Midwest, but the timing of fire and the way that fire is implemented is pretty unique down here. I think another maybe unique challenge in Florida is invasive species. So there's a lot of invasive species in Florida, both insect and plant. So how invasive plants change the ecosystems for bees. There are a few invasive or exotic bees that have naturalized in Florida. For example, the green orchid bee. So how those change plant pollinator interactions and affect native bees is another, I think, interesting. Certainly there are invasive species elsewhere, but because of its position, Florida is kind of particularly susceptible to invasives. So those are some of the challenges. In terms of crop pollination, Florida is also pretty unique. It's very diverse, a lot of specialty crops, a lot of pollinator-dependent crops. And that, maybe isn't necessarily a challenge for bees, but is an opportunity to study some unique aspects of pollination ecology because we have such a diversity of specialty crops here.
It's funny. We started off, it was like Florida and Oregon are so different, but Oregon also has huge specialty crops.
Yeah.
We've got urban encroachment throughout. We've got forests that burn and pollinator communities up there. Wow, we're joined at the hip.
Yeah, it's true.
It's nice. But we don't have any orchid bees.
Yes, that is one difference. But no, you're right. A lot of the crops that I've been started to work with are ones that you have up there. So a lot of the same specialty crops. I guess one difference is in the very southern part of the state, we have some tropical crops like mangoes that you're not going to find elsewhere. Mm-hmm. A lot of those crops are really just in that very kind of small swath around Miami. So Gainesville, I'm located more in the northern part of the state. So a lot of what we have, like strawberries, blueberries, melons, you probably have those in Oregon too.
We do, but it does strike me that there are these commonalities, where people go to settle, and you've got this forested land. Well, anyways, I'm surprised. Okay, well, this is really great, and I'm also the one thing that's really interesting about your position. You have an extension appointment, and there's this really wonderful, prestigious, long tradition of honeybee extension at the University of Florida. Can you tell us a little bit about your new program and how it sort of overlaps or is different from the current apiculture program?
Well, my program, I've been in this position for about a year, so I'm still figuring out exactly my target audiences, but one thing I did when I first started was to reach out to stakeholders in county extension and figure out what some of the needs are for extension related to my position of native wild bees and pollination ecology. And right now I'm focusing primarily on growers of specialty crops and other stakeholders within that specialty crop industry, primarily blueberries and strawberries and also potentially melons. And then my other kind of focal group or target audience are gardeners, in particular master gardeners, but they can also be garden clubs and even conservation organizations. So my main goals are to enhance crop pollination, but also to enhance resources for bees and to provide best management practices for bee conservation in public and private lands. And so those are the groups that I work with, and it's pretty different from someone who's honeybee extension and works with beekeepers. I think one big difference is just that they have maybe a more identifiable audience. You know who you're going to be working with, the beekeepers. And for me, in my position, there are a lot of different groups that are interested in or affected by, in some way, shape, or form, other pollinators and pollination. So there's maybe not one kind of clear audience. I also think to some extent, I probably get less emergency type, come out and check out my hives, what's going on, things are dying. It's more kind of general interest and concern, people wanting to do things. Certainly from the specialty crop growers, I get some urgent questions about pollination. But I think compared to the honeybee extension program, I maybe have to generate interest. I have to kind of work a little bit harder to get people invested. Whereas the beekeepers, their livelihood is at stake. So there's maybe a little more urgency there. I think day to day too, my extension appointment, it's a smaller part of my program. So I do some extension, but I do a lot of other stuff. And Dr. Jamie Ellis, who does honeybee extension, his appointment's mostly extension. So it's a bigger part of his job.
What you said, though, makes a lot of sense. As somebody else who's in pollinator health extension, there is a way in which you do have to you have a lot more stakeholders and some of them may not have very much in common, yet they're all managing land.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely, right. And you've got people that are managing small amounts of land that are just homeowners or gardeners, and then you have people that are involved in restoration. You have foresters. There's a lot of forestry here in the Southeast. So, a lot of different landowners managing different tracts of land, sizes of land, types of land. So it's a pretty diverse group. And then, of course, you have the specialty crop growers that are also managing land, but in very different ways.
Okay, so I just want to circle back to the crop pollination part of it. And I guess, 20, 30 years ago, people really thought about honeybees, and there was like a hard sell to try and get honey growers to sort of bring colonies onto their land. But this is a different time now, and I guess there's a lot of interest about incorporating native bees into commercial crop pollination. What are some of the real opportunities for doing that in Florida?
I think, again, the three crops that I'm focusing on, which are more specific to maybe the northern two-thirds of Florida, melons, strawberries, blueberries. Certainly for melons and blueberries, growers know that they need insects. For strawberries, I think one opportunity for increasing pollination or even increasing the role of both managed and wild pollinators in that pollination is to evaluate to what extent yields are limited by pollination. A lot of strawberry growers don't bring in bees. They're just relying on what's happening naturally, the natural insect communities. And they don't really know whether the yields that they're receiving are limited by pollination, whether yields could increase with pollinators. So I think that there's an opportunity there to potentially boost yields or to evaluate whether yields could be boosted through better pollination. And that includes by managed pollinators, but also certainly by wild pollinators. Now they're relying almost exclusively on the wild pollinators. And I think in blueberries, it's a little bit of a different story, and it's pretty interesting there. So blueberries in Florida, the cultivars that we grow have been bred to bloom quite early. And so in many cases, they're blooming right now. And they're blooming in a period where there's not a lot of bee activity. There's a fairly short overwintering period here, but there is a little bit of lull in activity. We do get freezes. So they've kind of been decoupled, the plants and the pollinators. Mm-hmm. And so this has increased reliance on managed bees. So growers bring in managed bees. But that being said, we do see some bumblebees, and we also see the southeastern blueberry bee. And I think that there may be ways that growers...
Wait a second. The southeastern blueberry bee?
Yes. Yep. Also,
I want to hear about that.
Yes. It's a beautiful bee. It actually looks a bit like Bombus impatiens.
Uh-huh.
An eastern bumblebee. So it's not as hairy, but otherwise it looks quite similar. And it's a really excellent pollinator for blueberries. It frequently visits blueberries. It'll visit other related species as well. But it's a really great pollinator, and it's quite abundant in Florida. So I believe in other blueberry producing regions, especially like Michigan and the Northeast, if it's there, it's found in pretty low numbers. So they have found it further north, but it's just not very common.
Okay.
Really increases in frequency as you move into the southeast. So growers in Georgia and Florida could be receiving a bit of pollination from this bee. So we need to figure out, can we increase populations of both bumblebees and this southeastern blueberry bee? And can we increase their contribution to pollination? Because they're out there, but in part, I think because of the timing of blueberry bloom, but also maybe in part because of land management or other factors, the growers are relying pretty heavily on managed honeybees. So I think there's the opportunity there to increase pollination by other bees, but it might not be real easy.
Have some of the growers already, before you arrived there, started to try and experiment with getting the numbers up?
No one has, to my knowledge, done a whole lot of work with that. Certainly not in the way of, at least growers haven't implemented flower strips. There was a research project that UF participated in where they did look at the value of flower strips. And this was before I arrived, but I'm pretty sure their conclusions were just that the presence of flower strips, the implementation of that did not increase bumblebee, southeastern blueberry bee, or other pollinators in blueberries. I have heard some growers will say that they put out nesting habitat for bumblebees. So they put out upside down flower pots that have holes at the top and are filled with dirt. And, I don't know how successful that's been. So there's maybe been a little bit of either research or management by growers. But I think by and large, growers they rely on those managed honeybees. Some do bring in managed bumblebees. But other than the managed bumblebees and honeybees, there haven't been a lot of efforts to increase contributions by wild bees.
Well, let's take a break. I want to come back and hear, I know you're a year in, but I'm sure you've already got a lot of ideas for research projects and research projects that are underway right now. So it would be great to get a little glimpse into what you have planned.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, well, welcome back. It sounds like you've got the start of a real diverse and incredible research program. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects you have underway and some of the key questions that you're hoping to address in the next couple of years?
Sure. My program is aiming to be relatively diverse, as you said, spanning crop and non-crop habitats. In general, I think the two main themes are pollination ecology and plant-pollinator interactions. So some of the questions that I'm interested in are a little bit more specific to plant pollination biology and how plant floral traits affect plant-pollinator interactions. And then the second area is more wild bee community ecology. So how do disturbances in land management affect communities of wild bees? So along those two lines, one of the projects that we're starting is in blueberries. And I'm interested in the pollination ecology of blueberries. For one, just evaluating how dependent some of these modern cultivars are on insect pollinators, and also how pollen limited they are. So how much can we increase yields by improving pollination? And then I'm also interested in variation across cultivars and variation in their attractiveness to pollinators. So there's kind of anecdotal evidence that some of them are more attractive to bees than others. And I'm working with a blueberry breeder. We're trying to kind of identify what some of those traits might be. And one long-term goal would be to breed blueberries to make them more attractive to bees or other pollinators, although it's mostly bees. And then more on the management side of things, trying to figure out, again, how we can improve pollination. So we don't have a lot of recommendations for growers here in Florida. We are relying a lot on recommendations from places like Michigan, North Carolina, Oregon. So even just stocking densities, I mentioned earlier that growers use both honeybees and bumblebees, and they're not really sure at what densities they should be using these, and do they complement one another? So figuring out those questions for the growers. And then another big question that I find really interesting is planting design, and whether we need to have mixed cultivars and blocks or even within rows, and how are bees moving across these cultivars depending on the planting design. And I think blueberries offer a neat system to look at that, because many growers are now moving to potted blueberries. So they can kind of easily, maybe relatively easily move them around. It's probably not that simple, but they're putting blueberries out in pots. And
really?
So they're not putting them directly in the ground, a lot of the growers. So they might be able to more readily change the arrangement. And we can also more readily study that. So we can create manipulations of cultivars, mixed cultivars within blocks and rows, and look at how that affects cross-pollination and bee movement. So those are some of the things I'm interested in blueberries.
And those are all really interesting. I often, I think people often, when they think about pollinizers, they're thinking about fruit crops, but I mean tree fruit. But there, some of these cultivars may have some level of incompatibility, and I don't know. Out here, it's just one block of one kind of blueberry.
Right. Yeah, and some of the previous research has shown that, yes, there is a degree of self-incompatibility, but it does vary. So some cultivars are better at self-pollinating than others. Of course, you still need bees to release and deposit that pollen, even when they are self-compatible. But a lot of the more modern cultivars are supposedly more self-incompatible, and growers are told they can plant them in bigger blocks. But some growers aren't getting the fruit set that they might expect and are wondering whether that's really true. So I think doing some experiments to look at that would be really interesting. And especially in older parts of the farm, a lot of growers do have cultivars alternating every other row. So they might maybe plant 2 rows of one cultivar and 1 row of another. So at least in the past, they were told to mix it up like that.
That's fascinating. And the other one is the attractiveness. I know there's some we have some later cultivars here in Oregon that bloom coincidentally with some of the blooming trees, and it's really hard to keep the bees on the blueberry.
Yes, right. And that, I think, is something the growers are really concerned about here too. Being new to Florida, I don't know exactly what flowers at the same time, especially because blueberries have been bred to bloom so early in Florida. They get a much higher price for those early berries. So the breeders are pushing earlier and earlier varieties. But I think there are things that do bloom as early as January and February in the surrounding landscape. And that's definitely something growers are concerned with, is how do we keep the bees on the blueberries.
And you also mentioned in the first segment that you're interested in these bee communities in forests. What are you thinking about doing there?
Yeah, so I started collaborating with a fire ecologist, and she's interested in managing these early successional habitats. And a couple of the management tools that are used in these early succession habitats include fire, prescribed fire. And I mentioned in Florida that the fire can happen at different times during the year. So it can happen in the winter, it can happen in the early spring, it can happen in the late spring. And so we have an experiment set up where we have plots that are burned at different times. And I'm interested in looking at how the timing of fire affects the phenology of plants and also pollinators, and how that affects their interactions. She also is looking at the management of some early successional weedy invasive plants. And so we're going to be looking at how removal of those plants affects flower diversity and abundance, and thereby affects pollinator diversity and abundance. So can we improve the diversity and abundance of floral rewards for pollinators by controlling some of these early successional weedy species that take over? So the goals of that project are sort of twofold: to look at fire disturbance and specifically the timing of fire and how that affects plant pollinator phenology and interactions, and then also looking at management of these early successional weedy species and how that affects flower abundance and diversity.
Oh, fascinating. You know, one other thing that you mentioned previously is you have this big group of master gardeners, and people gardening in Florida must be pretty like a big occupation.
Yes. Oh, it's huge. I mean, I didn't realize when I first moved down here, it's like everyone, well, not everyone, but many people have landscape service. And, you know, coming from North Dakota, like no one hires landscapers. So, but the yards are just incredible. People's yards are really beautiful.
So tell us a little bit about some of the work you're doing associated with the green industry and growing things in people's backyards.
Sure. So I've been doing a lot of extension, as you mentioned, with master gardeners. And one thing that's become pretty clear is that we don't really have good lists of plants for native wild bees in Florida. There's a lot more information available about butterflies and hummingbirds. And I think there's just a longer tradition and history of gardening for butterflies and hummingbirds. So I'd like to help develop that. And I've started working with a few faculty members in environmental horticulture. And we're going to be testing some of these popular ornamentals as well as wildflowers. Many of these are marketed as pollinator friendly or bee plants, but they haven't really been tested. And so we're going to be looking at their relative attractiveness to bees, specifically bees, in these single species plots. And in addition to looking at a few different species of ornamentals and wildflowers, we're going to be looking at variation across cultivars. So I guess that's an interest that I kind of have in both agriculture and non-agricultural systems, is how do these floral traits vary across cultivars, even within a species. And many of these plants, like pentas, zinnias, lantana, there's just so many different cultivars. And the diversity of floral traits is pretty interesting.
It does.
So we're going to be, looking at that too.
No, it does remind me of an earlier episode we had with Emily Erickson in Penn State, that there is this kind of way which plant breeders have maybe created a whole host of different. It allows us to ask some questions about fundamental questions about what makes a plant attracted to pollinators.
Right, definitely. And one of the species that we're studying here, or one of the, it's really multiple species, but one of the genera that we're studying is lantana. And lantana, there are a few sterile cultivars. So these have been developed to be less invasive, but they are sterile, and I don't think they produce much pollen, or maybe pollen. And they certainly have different floral traits compared to some of the non-sterile cultivars. So I think that could be interesting to look at also.
Oh, same out here in Oregon with butterfly bush. You can't grow it here. It's sterile varieties. It's like, how does that affect pollinators, though? Yeah.
Right. I think
question.
That would be really interesting.
Wow, you have a lot going on. It's really impressive. It's and I can imagine just trying to keep up with all the demands in Florida will keep you busy for the next little while.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is. There's not a lot of people doing work specifically on crop pollination or on native wild bees and these non-cropping systems. So there's a lot of opportunity, but it is true that also uh, it's great to have that diversity, but you also have to keep up with all the different projects. So
Well, let's take a quick break. I've got a couple questions I want to ask you. We ask all our guests the same questions.
all right.
Here we go. Okay. Well, we're back, and I ask all our guests if they've got a book recommendation for people listening.
So I really like The Bees in Your Backyard by Wilson Carroll. I think that's a really great book because it's not a textbook, but it's also maybe a little more advanced than some of the other books on the topic. I think it provides some really great information about identification, which people are often interested in and don't really know where to start. You don't want to start with maybe discover life or some big key. So I think it's got some great information about identification, but then it also has some conservation information in there as well.
Yeah, it is really and the images and the writing. I think we've had other guests, but I always was struck by how well it's just composed. Like you can flip to any page and read it, and you can follow.
Yes, yeah, I really think it's very well done. I really like it.
Fantastic recommendation. Next question we have for you is if you've got a go-to tool for the kind of work that you do.
So this one is a little bit tricky, but I think I would say that, again, as someone who, in addition to wild bee community ecology, is really interested in pollination ecology and plant pollination biology, I might say pollinator exclusion bags or mesh. I think that's what I find myself using most frequently, actually.
Okay, describe these things.
Yeah, so that you can use different materials, and it's a little bit on the plant you're working with. It can be a very small bag of lightweight mesh that excludes pollinators. It could be a medium-sized to large bag if you want to cover a whole branch. Or I might even include in that category some kind of cage made of light mesh that could exclude pollinators from an entire tree or an entire bush. And we've used all three. We've used small bags that cover more like whole branches, and then even large cages that will exclude pollinators from larger areas.
I've always thought that these could be really well used in like a school garden program. But I imagine if there was an educator out there who's like, oh, I want to show my students the effect of pollination by excluding some flowers, but I don't know where to get these things. What would you recommend to them?
Ooh, that is a good question.
Do you make your own?
I don't. I think that most of the ones that we've gotten have actually been, so there's sort of two main sources. One is just garden stores, including online garden stores. So you can use just general insect exclusion. So for example, some of them are like no thrips. They're sold as no thrips bags to exclude thrips. Mm-hmm. So often, garden stores, online stores, or ones that you can drive to will have things like this. But there's also a company, I believe it's called Del Star, that sells specifically these sort of pollinator exclusion bags. And that's where we bought them in bulk. And Fantastic. And you can order them online. So that would be another source. But, I think you might even be able to use just like row cover. So that kind of gauzy, very lightweight white mesh that you can buy at any garden store, even like a home improvement store like Home Depot or Lowe's might carry it. And typically you use it to cover whole plants or rows to prevent pests. But I think you might even be able to use that.
Great.
I've never used that, so I don't know how the light intensity, one question is always how does it affect light intensity and moisture and things like that. I've never used that gauzy row fabric or mesh, but that's maybe a possibility too.
Well, the idea is if you had a blueberry branch or something, you would put it on before the flowers open, and then they would set fruit and take it off, and then you would measure it, I guess, to a branch that you didn't do that to.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So you have some where you've excluded pollinators and others where you haven't. And, if you can keep the bag on for as little time as possible, that's good because, again, it could have effects on light intensity, moisture, humidity. So often we put it on right before bloom, and then we actually take it off right after bloom. But we keep the little branch flagged so we know where we put the bag.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Once the bag's gone, like, where was it? Okay.
And then you can compare that to another branch.
Okay, that's a great recommendation. Thank you. You're the first pollinator exclusion bag recommender in 80 episodes.
Wow. Oh, that's interesting. I guess I'm revealing I'm moving more in a plant direction, I think, as I go along. So.
Oh, these 3 questions, they're about revelation.
Yeah.
And the last question we have is, do you have a favorite pollinator species?
Yeah, so I thought a little bit about this one, and again, it's kind of a tricky question because I think it changes over time as I work in new systems. But right now, I am really into the southeastern blueberry bee. So it's really beautiful. It's really abundant enough that you can study it, you notice it out there, but there's still quite a bit about its biology that we don't know. Jim Kane published some great papers a while back on it, but I think there's still a lot that we don't know about it, and it's really fun to watch. It's fun to watch it visiting blueberry flowers. So I really like that one. Back when I was in North Dakota, I worked a little bit with this. It's sometimes called the sunflower leafcutter bee, Megachile pugnata.
Oh yeah,
leafcutter bee, and it's just really cool looking. It's really beautiful, especially the males of that species. So that's another favorite.
Fantastic. We'll link those up on the show notes, and also you can learn more about Dr. Mallinger's program. We'll have links there. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us on pollination.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's a wrap. Thanks so much for listening. Show notes with information discussed in each episode can be found at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. We'd also love to hear from you, and there are several ways to connect. For one, you can visit our website to post an episode-specific comment, suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at pollinationpodcast@oregonstate.edu. Finally, you can tweet questions or comments or join our Facebook or Instagram communities. Just look us up at OSU Pollinator Health. If you like the show, consider letting iTunes know by leaving us a review or rating. It makes us more visible, which helps others discover pollination. See you next week.